The rain had been coming down for hours, a steady drumbeat on the hood of Marcus Reed's black Lexus as he cruised along Interstate 84. It was just past midnight, and the only light came from the occasional street lamp and the rhythmic sweep of his wipers. Marcus wasn't in a rush. He'd been at a conference in Boston all weekend, giving a keynote speech on criminal justice reform, and now he was headed home to Hartford. Normally, he would have driven straight through, but the coffee from the hotel lobby had long since worn off, and he needed a break. The glowing blue sign for a rest stop appeared just ahead, promising fuel, restrooms, and a 24-hour diner. Marcus signaled, exited, and pulled into the half-empty parking lot. Inside, the diner smelled of frying bacon and fresh coffee. A lone trucker sat at the counter, hunched over a plate of eggs, while the waitress topped off his mug. Marcus ordered a coffee to go, made small talk with the server, then headed back outside, sipping the hot brew and stretching his legs. That's when he noticed them. 2 state troopers, parked side by side in a corner of the lot, engines idling, headlights washing over the wet pavement. Both men were watching him. Not just casually, locked in, eyes narrowed, hands resting on their flashlights like they were deciding whether to use them. Marcus felt the familiar knot tighten in his gut. He had seen that look before. He opened his car door and was about to slide in when the cruiser doors swung open. The taller of the two, Officer Hayes, stepped out, his voice slicing through the rain. "Hey! Step away from the vehicle." Marcus froze. "Is there a problem, officer?" "License and registration," Hayes barked, ignoring the question. His partner, Officer Miller, circled around the back of the Lexus, shining his flashlight through the windows. Marcus stayed calm. "I wasn't driving just now. I pulled over for coffee." "What's the issue?" Hayes smirked. "We'll decide the issue. Step over here." Marcus complied, handing over his license. Hayes glanced at it, his expression tightening just slightly before handing it to Miller. "Run it," he said. Miller disappeared back to the cruiser. "What brings you out this way?" Hayes asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. "I was at a conference in Boston. Heading home." Hayes folded his arms. "Conference, huh? And what's in the briefcase?" "My work," Marcus said. "Court documents." That made Hayes laugh, a short, ugly sound. "You a lawyer or something?" "Something like that," Marcus replied evenly. Before Hayes could respond, Miller returned. "Clean record," he muttered. Hayes said. "You mind if we take a look inside the car?" "I do mind," Marcus said. "Unless you have probable cause, I'd rather not." That was the moment the atmosphere shifted. Hayes' eyes hardened. "Step back," he ordered. Marcus took a deep breath. "Officer, I know my rights." "Put your hands behind your back," Hayes snapped. "What?" "You're resisting a lawful investigation." "I'm not resisting. I'm simply—" Hayes didn't let him finish. He grabbed Marcus's arm, twisting it sharply behind his back. Marcus grunted in pain as Miller yanked the coffee cup from his other hand, spilling it onto the wet asphalt. "You're under arrest," Hayes said coldly. "For what?" Marcus demanded. "Obstruction," Hayes said. "And we'll see what else once we check that car." They cuffed him, shoved him toward the cruiser, and pushed his head down as they forced him inside. Through the rain-streaked window, Marcus could see them rifling through his Lexus, tossing aside papers and opening his briefcase without a warrant. Every muscle in his body was tight, but Marcus kept his face calm. He had been in courtrooms long enough to know that anger in moments like this was exactly what they wanted. As the cruiser pulled away from the rest stop, Hayes glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Bet you didn't think your night would end like this, huh?" Marcus looked him dead in the eye. "You have no idea how my night's going to end." Hayes chuckled, mistaking it for empty bravado. But Marcus knew something they didn't. By this time tomorrow, they wouldn't be looking down at him from the front seat of a patrol car. They'd be looking up at him from the defendant's table. The booking room at the county jail was lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs that made everything look sickly and gray. The air smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. Hayes kept a firm grip on Marcus's arm as Miller pushed open the door. "Got one for you," Hayes called to the desk sergeant. "Obstruction and resisting." The sergeant, an older man with a thinning hairline, glanced at Marcus's suit and polished shoes. "He doesn't look like your usual Friday night catch." "Yeah, well, he got mouthy," Hayes said, shoving Marcus forward. "Thinks he's smarter than us." Marcus kept his voice even. "I never raised my voice, never refused to comply with a lawful order." "Save it for your public defender," Hayes cut him off. The sergeant slid a clipboard toward him. "Name, date of birth." Marcus stared at the pen. His wrists were still cuffed behind him. "Hard to write like this." The sergeant shot Hayes a look. "Take them off." Hayes rolled his eyes but unlocked the cuffs. The steel had left angry red marks on Marcus's wrists. He picked up the pen and began writing in neat block letters. When the paperwork was done, they took his fingerprints and mugshot. The flash from the camera left a lingering white spot in his vision. "Empty your pockets," Miller said. Marcus set down his wallet, phone, and a silver pen, a gift from a mentor years ago. Miller pocketed the pen and smirked. "Confiscated for safety." "That's not standard procedure," Marcus said quietly. Miller leaned in. "Neither is talking back to a state trooper." They led him down a dim hallway to a holding cell. The metal door clanged shut behind him, the echo bouncing off the concrete walls. The cell was cold, with a single bench bolted to the wall. A man in a stained hoodie sat in the corner, head down, mumbling to himself. Marcus sat on the bench, back straight, and closed his eyes. He had dealt with countless defendants who'd been through this exact process. The dehumanizing treatment, the casual abuse of authority, but experiencing it firsthand was different. It settled deep in his bones, an ache that was equal parts anger and disappointment. An hour passed. Then another. The hum of the fluorescent lights was broken only by the occasional shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. Finally, the door opened. Hayes stepped in, leaning against the frame. "We went through your car. You got a lot of fancy legal stuff in there. You a lawyer?" Marcus looked at him steadily. "Something like that." Hayes smirked. "Bet it won't help you much in here. We'll see if we can get the DA to stick you with obstruction and maybe resisting arrest. That's good for a few thousand in fines." "And what do you get out of it?" Marcus asked. Hayes's smirk faltered for a moment. "Keeping the road safe." Marcus didn't answer. Hayes stared at him a second longer, then shut the door. Hours later, the sergeant returned with a plastic tray of food. Grayish meat, instant potatoes, and a cup of water. Marcus barely touched it. Around 4 a.m, they moved him to a smaller cell alone. No explanation. Just the clank of the door and the sound of keys turning in the lock. Marcus lay down on the narrow cot, staring at the ceiling. He thought of the irony, how many times he'd stood in court and told officers that no one was above the law, and here he was, being treated like someone who had no rights at all. But he also knew something else. Every moment of this was being documented, the unlawful search, the lack of probable cause, the confiscated property. He didn't need to raise his voice or argue his way out tonight. He just needed to get through until morning. And in the morning, the real tables would turn. At 8 a.m., a guard appeared at the cell door. "Reed. You're up." Marcus swung his legs over the cot and stood. "You're being released," the guard said. "Charges are pending." They handed him back his wallet and phone, but not the silver pen. He didn't ask for it. He'd get it back in a much more satisfying way. Outside, The sunlight was almost blinding after the long night under fluorescent bulbs. Marcus walked to the curb, hailed a cab, and gave the driver one word, "Courthouse." As the cab pulled away, Marcus glanced at his phone. The clerk had already sent him the docket for the day's hearings. Right there, at the bottom of the list, was a notation in bold. State of Connecticut vs. Officers Hayes and Miller, Internal Affairs Preliminary Hearing. Marcus smiled for the first time in 12 hours. The rain had washed the roads clean. It was going to be a beautiful day for justice. The morning sun poured through the blinds of the precinct's break room, catching in the steam rising from the burnt coffee in Officer Hayes's mug. He leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone, while Miller stirred a packet of sugar into his own cup. "Can't believe they cut him loose," Miller muttered. "Guy was cocky as hell. Should have been good for a few days inside." Hayes shrugged. "Some folks know how to work the system. Doesn't matter. We'll file the report, and the DA can tack on the charges later." "Yeah," Miller said, smirking. "Bet he won't be so smug once the fines hit him." They both laughed, the sound low and self-satisfied. From across the room, Sergeant Fuller cleared his throat. "You too," he said, jerking his chin toward them. "Internal Affairs wants you at the courthouse at 10. Something about a review of last night's stop." Hayes frowned. "That was fast." Fuller shrugged. "Don't ask me. Just show up." The courthouse lobby smelled faintly of floor polish and old paper. People bustled through the metal detectors, lawyers juggling files, defendants in ill-fitting suits, officers from different precincts chatting in low voices. Hayes and Miller signed in at the clerk's desk. The clerk, a woman with sharp glasses and an unreadable expression, glanced at their names and tapped something into her computer. "You're in hearing room 2, she said. "Judge will be in shortly." They made their way down the polished hallway, their boots clicking against the tile. Inside, the room was smaller than a trial court, just a single long table for the parties, a row of benches for observers, and the elevated bench for the judge. Hayes dropped into a chair, leaning back like he owned the place. "Bet it's some greenhorn judge fresh out of law school," he said. "They'll hear our side, close the file, and that's that." Miller chuckled. "Yeah. No way they're making a big deal over one mouthy driver." They didn't notice the courtroom door open behind them. Meanwhile, Marcus stood in his chambers, straightening the black robe over his crisp shirt and tie. The familiar weight of it settled across his shoulders like armor. He'd gotten to the courthouse early, partly to prepare, partly to center himself. He had reviewed the case file, the internal affairs complaint triggered by a civilian's dashcam footage from another vehicle at the rest stop. It showed Hayes and Miller ordering him out of the car without cause, searching his belongings without a warrant, and using unnecessary force during the arrest. Every second of it was admissible. Every second of it told the truth. Marcus slipped his docket folder under his arm and stepped into the side hall that led directly to hearing room 2. The bailiff was already there. "Morning, Judge Reed," he said, holding the door for him. Marcus nodded. "Morning." The moment Hayes and Miller looked up, time seemed to stutter. Hayes's smirk froze halfway. Miller's coffee-colored eyes went wide. Marcus walked calmly to the bench, placed his folder on the polished wood, and sat. He adjusted his glasses, then looked down at them from the elevated seat. "Officers Hayes and Miller," he said, his voice smooth but carrying across the room. "You are here today for a preliminary hearing regarding your conduct during a vehicle stop on Interstate 84 last night. I will be presiding." Hayes swallowed hard. "Your Honor." Marcus held up a hand. "You will have your opportunity to speak when I ask for it. Until then, you will remain silent." The bailiff stepped forward, his expression stern. "All rise for Judge Reed." It was unnecessary. Everyone was already on their feet, stunned. The irony hung thick in the air. Hayes shifted uncomfortably, and Miller's jaw clenched. Marcus opened the file. For the record, I was the individual you arrested last night. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. I want to make it clear, Marcus continued, that my position here will not shield you from a fair hearing. The facts will speak for themselves. And the facts, in this case, have been recorded from multiple angles. Miller shot Hayes a panicked look. Hayes's lips pressed into a thin line. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes never leaving theirs. Gentlemen, I suggest you choose your words carefully today. Your careers may depend on them. In the back row, a reporter shifted in her seat, pen poised above her notebook. She hadn't expected this story when she walked into the room. Neither had they. The hum of the ceiling fan was the only sound in the hearing room as Marcus adjusted his glasses and flipped open the first page of the file. Let's begin, he said, his voice calm, even. The charges under review are unlawful detention, unlawful search, and use of excessive force during a traffic stop. Hayes cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may. You may not, Marcus cut in, his tone still polite but edged with steel. You will speak when you are called upon. Until then, you will listen. Miller shifted in his seat, eyes darting toward the courtroom door as if looking for an escape. Marcus glanced toward the clerk. Please enter Exhibit A into the record. The clerk tapped a few keys on the laptop connected to the courtroom's monitor. A grainy video filled the screen, dashcam footage from a civilian vehicle that had pulled into the rest stop just minutes before the incident. There was no audio at first, just the sight of Marcus stepping out of his Lexus, coffee cup in hand. Then Hayes and Miller approached, their postures aggressive, their flashlights cutting through the rain. Marcus kept his eyes on the footage, not on the officers. For the record, this was captured by a third party with no connection to myself or the officers. The timestamp matches the incident report filed at 12:17 a.m. The audio kicked in, the tinny sound filling the room. Hayes's voice rang out, "Hey! Step away from the vehicle." The video showed the entire exchange, including Marcus calmly stating he hadn't been driving at that moment, his request for probable cause before a search, and finally Hayes's abrupt move to arrest him. When the footage reached the moment Hayes twisted Marcus's arm and Miller dumped his coffee onto the pavement, the reporter in the back scribbled furiously. "Pause there," Marcus instructed. The screen froze on Hayes's hand gripping Marcus's arm, the rain catching in the flashlight's beams. "Officers," Marcus said slowly, "do you still maintain, under oath, that you had probable cause to search my vehicle?" Hayes's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Miller cleared his throat. "We believed the suspect, the driver, was acting suspiciously." Marcus arched an eyebrow. "Suspiciously? For drinking coffee in a rest stop parking lot?" Miller's face flushed. "We didn't know what was in the cup." Marcus allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. "Interesting. Did you perform any field tests on the contents?" "No, sir." Marcus leaned forward. "Then you arrested a citizen without confirming whether your suspicion had any basis in fact. That is not standard police procedure, that is harassment." The words landed like a gavel strike. Hayes shifted in his seat, his earlier arrogance evaporating. "Your Honor, with all due respect." "You will address the facts," Marcus interrupted. "Not your feelings." The clerk resumed the video. This time, the footage switched to the station's own booking camera, obtained through a formal request Marcus had filed that morning. It showed Hayes and Miller bringing him in, the smirks, the confiscated pen, and Miller's "neither is talking back to a state trooper" comment. The room went still. "Pause," Marcus said again. "That statement, would you care to explain it, Officer Miller?" Miller swallowed. "I misspoke." "You did not," Marcus replied evenly. "You revealed the real motive behind the arrest. Not public safety. Not lawful suspicion. Ego." Hayes shot Miller a glare that could have set paper on fire. Marcus sat back in his chair, letting the silence stretch. Officers, I spent last night in a holding cell because you decided your authority gave you the right to bypass the law. You were mistaken. The reporter's pen scratched furiously. Hayes finally spoke, his voice low. We were just doing our jobs. Marcus met his eyes. No. You were doing whatever you thought you could get away with. He turned to the clerk. Enter Exhibit B, the arrest report filed by these officers. The clerk handed copies to both men. Please review the section where you state the vehicle search was conducted after detecting the odor of alcohol. Miller's eyes widened. Hayes's grip on the paper tightened. Marcus tapped the table in front of him. Gentlemen, I do not drink. Medical records on file confirm that. Furthermore, the dashcam footage, which we have just reviewed, shows no mention or indication of such an odor until after you initiated the unlawful search. The color drained from Hayes's face. Tomorrow, Marcus continued, this file will be forwarded to Internal Affairs, the state's Attorney General, and the Civilian Review Board. You will have the opportunity to present a defense. But right now, you have one chance to explain yourselves, and I suggest you consider your words very carefully. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the heavy silence. Miller leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. We made a mistake. Marcus didn't smile. No, Officer Miller. You made a choice. The hearing room felt smaller now, as though the walls were inching closer with every passing minute. The air was thick, the kind of heavy silence that made every shuffle of paper sound deafening. Marcus closed the arrest report and set it aside. We've established that your initial stop lacked probable cause, that your search violated constitutional protections, and that your report contains false statements. The question before this hearing is whether these were acts of negligence, or willful misconduct. Hayes sat rigid, his hands clasped on the table. Your Honor, if I may. Marcus nodded once. You may. Hayes drew in a slow breath, as though trying to steady himself. We patrol that stretch of highway every night. We've had multiple drug busts at that rest stop in the past month. When we saw a lone driver in a high-end car, we thought. Marcus's eyebrow arched. You thought what, exactly? That the make of my car justified violating my rights? Hayes hesitated. We profile based on patterns. You profile based on prejudice, Marcus corrected sharply. Patterns are data. Prejudice is assumption. And the law does not grant you the authority to treat the two as the same. Miller glanced between them, his knee bouncing under the table. We didn't know who you were, he blurted. That, Marcus said, leaning forward, is precisely the problem. Because who I am should not matter. Every citizen deserves the same protection under the law, whether they are a judge, a janitor, or a teenager in a hoodie. The words hung in the air like the final note of a symphony. From the back of the room, the reporter looked up from her notepad, her eyes locked on Marcus. The bailiff shifted his stance by the door, his gaze on the officers. Marcus gestured to the clerk. Play Exhibit C. The monitor flickered, showing security footage from the evidence room. It caught Miller pocketing the silver pen during booking. The camera zoomed just enough to make his smirk visible. Officer Miller, Marcus said evenly, stealing personal property from an arrestee, is that standard practice at your precinct? Miller's face turned crimson. It was just a pen. It was theft, Marcus snapped. And when committed under color of authority, it is a criminal offense. Miller's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Hayes shot him a glare so sharp it could cut glass. You idiot. Enough, Marcus said, his voice booming in the small space. This is not a place for you to argue with each other. This is a place where the truth is laid bare. He leaned back, letting the silence settle before speaking again. You both wore the badge last night. You both represented the law. And you both disgraced it. The officers sat in stony silence. Marcus's tone softened, but his words cut even deeper. Do you know how many people walk into a courtroom terrified because they believe the system is stacked against them? How many young men are convinced they'll never get a fair shake because of how they look? Neither officer answered. Last night, Marcus continued, you proved them right. A flicker of shame crossed Miller's face. Hayes looked down at his hands. I have served as a public defender. I have stood in court against officers who abused their authority. And I have defended officers when accusations were unfounded. I believe in the law, but the law is nothing without integrity. He tapped the folder in front of him. My recommendation to Internal Affairs will be suspension pending full investigation. Given the evidence, I will also recommend referral to the state prosecutor for possible criminal charges. You will be notified of your hearing dates. Hayes's head snapped up. You're ending our careers. No, Marcus said, his voice steady. You ended your own careers when you decided the law was a weapon instead of a shield. The bailiff stepped forward. Officers, you're excused. Neither man moved at first. Then, slowly, they stood. Miller's eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Hayes gave Marcus one last glare, but it lacked the fire it once had. As they walked toward the door, the reporter scribbled one final note: Judge confronts arresting officers in their own misconduct hearing. When the door closed behind them, Marcus exhaled quietly. It wasn't victory, not yet. But it was the first step toward making sure they could never do to someone else what they'd done to him. 2 weeks later, the story had spread far beyond Connecticut. What had started as a small blurb in the Hartford Times, Judge presides over misconduct hearing of officers who arrested him, had exploded into national headlines. Morning talk shows debated it. Social media lit up with clips from the hearing, especially the moment Marcus told the officers, you ended your own careers when you decided the law was a weapon instead of a shield. By the time the Internal Affairs report was complete, Hayes and Miller had been suspended without pay. The state's attorney general announced that both men would face misdemeanor charges for unlawful detention, unlawful search, and theft under color of authority. For the first time in his career, Marcus didn't preside over the final stage of a case he'd been directly involved in. He knew better than to blur those lines. But he didn't need to be in the courtroom to know how it ended. Both officers accepted plea deals. Forfeiting their badges, agreeing never to work in law enforcement again, and performing community service. Miller returned the silver pen in a manila envelope, no note enclosed. Marcus sat in his chambers one quiet Friday afternoon, looking out the tall window at the city below. From up here, the courthouse steps looked small, but he knew the weight of what happened on them every day. His clerk knocked and stepped inside. Judge Reed? Someone's here to see you. Send them in, Marcus said. A woman in her mid-30s walked in, her eyes hesitant but determined. She wore a simple blazer over a floral dress, her hands clasped together. You don't know me, she began, but I wanted to thank you. Marcus tilted his head. For what? My brother, she said softly. Last year, he was arrested at that same rest stop. Said they searched his car without cause, roughed him up. But no one believed him. Watching you stand up to them, it meant something. Marcus's chest tightened. I'm sorry that happened to him. He's doing better now, she said. But I wanted you to know, people are paying attention. She left as quietly as she came. That night, Marcus drove the same route home along Interstate 84. The rain had returned, pattering softly against the windshield. As he passed the rest stop, he slowed, glancing toward the dimly lit diner and the parking lot beyond. It looked the same as it had that night, but it felt different. Not safer, not yet. Just, different. He pulled into the lot and sat for a moment, sipping coffee from a fresh paper cup. The hum of a truck's engine filled the air. Somewhere behind him, a state cruiser idled, its lights off. Marcus didn't flinch. He knew there were good officers out there, men and women who wore the badge with honor, who understood the trust it carried. But he also knew that trust was fragile, and once broken, it was hard to repair. The fight to protect that trust wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who believed in the law as something more than a tool for power. 2 months later, Marcus was invited to speak at a national law enforcement conference. The audience was a mix of police chiefs, community advocates, and young cadets just beginning their careers. He stood at the podium, his black robe replaced by a simple navy suit, the silver pen clipped neatly to his inside pocket. "I am not here to tell you how to do your jobs," he began. "I am here to remind you why you have them." He told them the story of that night without names or sensationalism, focusing instead on the choices made, and how those choices reflected on the badge. He spoke about accountability, about the courage it took to admit wrong, and about the damage caused when power was abused. When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then the applause came, slow, steady, building until it filled the hall. Marcus didn't smile. Not out of pride, but out of resolve. This was only one battle in a much larger war for justice. Later that evening, as he left the conference hall, a young cadet caught up to him. "Judge Reed," the cadet said, a nervous tremor in his voice. I wanted to say, if I ever get out there, I hope I remember what you said today. About the badge being a shield, not a weapon." Marcus met his gaze. "Hold on to that," he said. "It's easy to forget once you're out there. Don't let yourself." The cadet nodded firmly. Marcus walked away into the cool night air, his breath forming faint clouds. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, not a threat, not tonight. Just another part of the city's rhythm. For the first time since that rainy night at the rest stop, he felt lighter. Justice hadn't erased the wrong, but it had answered it. And for Marcus Reed, that was enough to keep going.